Mike Corpy was a child of immigrants. His father had moved from the northwestern part of Europe and Scandinavia to the Pacific Northwest. And because of that, he found himself growing up in the lush green of southern Washington state. He came of age, went to school, and ended up becoming a lawyer and marrying, settling in the city of Seattle, and having a family. Mike had a trained legal mind. He was insightful. He was curious. He was analytical. But Mike was also a very accomplished violinist. And people who knew him best said that he was a musician at heart. As a young man, when he was in college, Mike encountered an evangelical ministry at the school that he attended that changed his life. And he lived his adult life as a faithful and committed believer and follower of Jesus Christ. About 2 years ago, just a few weeks before the global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic would turn the world upside down, Mike got news that turned his own personal world upside down. He was diagnosed with kidney cancer. And though Mike Corpy faced that diagnosis bravely and faced the difficult treatments that would come in the months that followed bravely as well, it was an aggressive cancer, and it became clear after a while that it was not going to be held in check, but was going to spread all over his body until it overwhelmed him. Finally, about a year ago, in early 2021, Mike realized that his time was growing short. I know about Mike because the man to my left, Pastor Danny, was great friends with him and has shared his story with me. Pastor Danny knew about his diagnosis, and even though it's been some years since Pastor Danny and his family moved from Seattle to come back to Arkansas, they had kept up. They were friends, and they had continued to visit with one another. And so he knew kind of where Mike stood, but that didn't make it any easier for him to receive a text message from Mike that ended up becoming the last one that he would ever send to his friends. That text message read this. It said, "Dear friends, this text may very well be my last communication with you. Please know that none of your thoughts, prayers, visits, and food has been taken for granted. My diet, such as it is, has recently been reduced to grapes and ice water. And I've noticed changes in my cognitive capacity. Carol is always at the ready with her fabled competence and support, so I'm well taken care of in my spiffy hospital bed." And then Mike adds at the end of that text message, "Please be assured, however, that I'm looking forward to the ongoing adventure that lies ahead." Mike Corpy would pass away and go on to be with Jesus not long after he hit send on that final text message. Now, how do we think about such a thing? How do we think about such a thing? What I would suggest to you, friends, is that Mike Corpy's death was not a tragedy. What might have been a tragedy if his life had been taken from him by a burglar or an assailant who was doing violence against him, was committing a sin against him. We might have called that a tragedy. If Mike had died without knowing the Lord Jesus, we might have called that a tragedy. If he had approached the end of his life filled with fear and dread about what lay in front of him, we might have called that a tragedy. But none of those things was true with Mike. He knew exactly what was happening. And if you just take him at his word, he didn't appear to be filled with fear at all. As a matter of fact, if you just read the words of that text message, what appears to be happening is, it appears that he is worried about other people who might be troubled to know at what is happening to him. And so he is reaching out to them, trying to provide them comfort of all things. And then at the very end of that text message, he acts positively excited about what he's getting ready to experience. Please be assured, I'm looking forward to the ongoing adventure that lies ahead. The topic for this message in our series, our ongoing series on death and the afterlife, is how am I to get ready to die? How should I get ready to die? It's the kind of topic that might, at first glance, seem heartbreaking. What I want to suggest to you this morning is that for believers, it isn't really heartbreaking at all. There is a passage in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 27, that says in part, it is appointed for man to die once. When we talk about death out of the scriptures, that is a verse that gets quoted a lot. And I'll admit to you that that's a stark way of putting it. I mean, even the wording there, it is appointed. There is no getting around it. It is inevitable. There's nothing that you can do to stop it. It is appointed for man to die once. But in another way of looking at it, it's simply stating the obvious, isn't it? We know that to be true. We know that we're going to die one day. There will be a generation of people who will be living on this earth when Christ returns in glory. They will be here living and breathing to behold him when he comes down at the trumpet sound. But for all the rest of us, for those generations up until that generation, we are all going to experience death. It's something that we all have to go through. And if it's something that we are all going to go through, does it not make sense that it's something that we would prepare for? I mean, if death is something that every single one of us is going to go through, would it not make sense that it would be something that we would get ready for? Let me give you an example. Here in the church, we have a program called Created by God. And it's a program that's designed for 5th and 6th graders who are at the onset of adolescence, who are getting ready to go through puberty. And this program brings kids into the church, and over the course of a weekend, it helps them to get ready for those monumental changes that are going to happen to their bodies, that are going to happen to their emotions, that are going to happen to their minds. I mean, in our wisdom, we do not believe that it should simply be left for the schoolyard playground to educate our children on what's going to happen. That's kind of how I found out, for what it's worth. There was no Created by God program at my church. But we have that here, and what we ask is for children and their parents to embrace this program as a good thing to help get kids ready for adolescence. Now, if we do that for puberty, doesn't it make sense that we would do it for something as significant and life-changing as our own deaths? When you read that final text from Mike Corpy, what you realize is this is someone who had done the work to get ready to die. Did you pick up on that? As you were hearing that text? This is someone who knew what season of life he was in. He was paying attention to what was happening to his body. He knew what was coming down the pike in the next few days or weeks. And so he had done that spiritual work to get ready to die. And because of that, he could talk about his death not as something that he dreaded, but as something that he was ready for, that he was prepared for, that he was even in a certain sense looking forward to. Did you know that there is a great difference between the way that most modern people think about death and the way that our ancestors in ancient and medieval times thought about death? Did you know that? There was a change sometime from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century where people started thinking about death differently. We don't like to think about death at all. In fact, most people don't even die in their homes anymore. We actually send people to the hospital to die. We remove death as far from our own day-to-day lives as we can. It wasn't like that in the past at all. Now today, when you ask people how it is that they want to die, do you want to know what the most common response that you'll get is? In your sleep, right? I heard a couple of people say that. I want to die in my sleep. You can add some stuff to it. I want to die quickly and painlessly and in my sleep. Now, would it surprise you to know that in ancient times and in the medieval period, the idea of dying quickly in your sleep was horrifying to people? Do you know that? The notion of the sudden death was the last thing that people wanted to experience. And the reason was quite simple. Because they thought if they had unrepentant sin upon their hearts, if they had sin in their lives that they needed to confess, then dying suddenly or dying in their sleep would rob them of the opportunity to confess sin before God and to receive forgiveness. I mean, these were a people who took sin and the brokenness of sin and the separation that sin represents in our relationship from the Lord with utter seriousness. They never wanted to die suddenly and in their sleep. They wanted the opportunity to be reconciled to the one that they knew as their creator and their redeemer. You see. They went beyond that. Because they also knew, as we do in our own lives, that at times you suffer from broken relationships with the people around you. You may have a broken relationship with your spouse. You may have a broken relationship with your children. You may have a broken relationship with your neighbors or of people that otherwise you would call your friends and your loved ones. And if you died suddenly and in your sleep, then you would not have the opportunity to reach out to those people in your life and to ask them for forgiveness. Or perhaps, if needs be, to offer them forgiveness in return. You would never want to die without the opportunity to set things right, you see. And so the best death that you could have was a death that you saw coming, a death that you could prepare for, a death for which you could get ready. It's worth thinking about. One of the most famous and beloved figures in all of Christian history is this guy. You know who that is? That's St. Francis of Assisi. This is the kind of guy that it's not just the Catholics that like him. Everybody likes St. Francis. I mean, if you were to go in the gardens of all of our backyards, you'd probably find as many stone statues of St. Francis as you would of Jesus. And the reason people like him so much is that he was well known as somebody who went out into the woods and preached to the critters. He preached to birds and he preached to squirrels. He was so filled with the joy of the gospel that he wanted all of God's creatures to hear it, not just the two-legged kind. And so oftentimes when you'll see paintings of St. Francis, you'll see him with critters. But there's another item that you also almost see him with. In fact, you see it with him more frequently. In almost every image after St. Francis's life that bears his form, you'll see this image, and you see it right there in those two pictures. What is it? It's a human skull. Now, sometimes he's holding it. Do you see the picture on the left? He's caught up in prayer. He's got his eyes lifted up to the heavens. He's holding a human skull in his hands. The image over there on the right, can't see it quite as well. The image is not quite as sharp, but look very carefully down in the lower right-hand corner of the frame. There's a wooden cross that's leaned over on a rock. Underneath the wooden cross on its side, a human skull. Now, apparently, this is not just something that people made up about St. Francis. He actually did this. He walked around with a skull in his hands. He was famous for coming into breakfast in the monastic community where he lived. He would walk into breakfast, and all the monks would be seated around a breakfast table, and he would walk in and put a skull on the table and sit down to eat breakfast. Why would he do such a thing? Was it because he was morbid? No, it wasn't. It was because he knew he was going to die. I mean, St. Francis was a man who was not in particularly good physical health. He died at the age of 44. He thought he might die at any time, and he wanted to be ready, you see. And so for him, carrying around this symbol of mortality was just a reminder of what it was that he was going to experience. And he wasn't afraid of it. He actually saw death as the portal to direct communion with Jesus. There was no way that he was ever going to come to know Jesus face to face but through the experience of death. And so he thought of death, even in one of his poems, he thought of death as a friend, as something not to be feared but to be welcomed when it came because of the gift, the liberating gift that it would give him to be with Jesus. Now, we have a problem with that. I mean, could all of you that brought your skulls in with you, could you hold them up right now? Right? Yeah. No skulls. No skulls. The only skulls that are in the sanctuary today are the ones on top of our necks, right? Yeah. So we don't walk around and put skulls on the breakfast table next to our orange juice and our cereal. We don't like to think about death. And that is something that our culture has actually done to us. We separate death as far from ourselves as we possibly can. I actually learned a little bit about this in a very interesting way last fall when I found myself on a church bus sitting in front of our very own Lynn Redding on our way up to a preaching and a worship conference up in the Nashville area. And Lynn started telling me about the work that she does. Lynn is I know this is going to be very self-conscious for you, Lynn. I'm talking about you and you're right behind me. Just bear with me, okay? Lynn is a professional organizer. That's what she does. Did you know that? Lynn is a professional organizer. And when I say those words, if you get suddenly a kind of a panicky feeling about all the stuff that you've got in your closets back home, well, you kind of get it. You kind of get what she does. What Lynn does is she helps people downsize. So sometimes she helps people downsize when they're moving to a new town and they want to get rid of a bunch of stuff. Sometimes she helps people downsize when they are moving out of the house, the big house where they've raised their kids, and they want to move into a smaller home for retirement. Sometimes she helps families downsize when a loved one has died and they are having to distribute the things of the estate. In all of that, what Lynn Redding does in her ministry, she describes it as a ministry, is that she helps people learn to let go. And that, my fellow Americans, is something that is very difficult for us. In our society, it is very difficult for us to let go. I was so intrigued by the way that Lynn talked about it that I asked if she would share some of that with us today. And so she and Pastor Jen sat down a few days ago and recorded a conversation. And if we can turn the lights down a little bit, I want to show some of that conversation to you right now.
You talk a lot about, artwork, and there are certain things that people, and maybe you found this, there's certain things that people have a harder time letting go of. And so talk to us about that and tell us what's the hardest part of your job?
The hardest part is helping people decide what to do with that kind of stuff. And when people wait too late, that's when it gets overwhelming and too stressful for them. And most people do. We tend to procrastinate because it's not, for some reason, our society doesn't really teach us that. Our culture teaches us to accumulate and to do and be and become, and with all of that comes stuff.
So what do you think that people's possessions represent to them?
It represents what they've done and who they've been, and that's where I think we kind of fail. We want our children to do well. We want to do well. We're talented. We're creative, and we need to continue that. That's part of who we are. But with a lot of that comes a lot of baggage. Another thing that I encourage people to do is, if you're putting it in a box, then that's not giving it a place of honor. You're not valuing it. So if it's important to you, give it a place of honor. So and that's my way of saying, stuff has the awards have a time frame. They have a shelf life, or I call it an expiration date. In fact, another thing I say is, everything has an expiration date except the Word of God and the souls of mankind.
That's so good. Okay, but in my mind, as you're saying this, the only thing I can think about is driving around town and seeing all of these storage units and these storage facilities, you know, with dozens of, and I mean, heated and air conditioned. And what is that? I mean, why do we have so much stuff that we're having to purchase units outside of our home even to hold all of this stuff that we accumulate?
It's our culture that places value on getting and being and doing, and all of that comes with it. And we're not taught to let go of things. We're taught to accumulate. I mean, I tell people, I say, the marketers are spending $1 gazillion to make sure that we know about their product, and guess what? It's working. So that's where we as Christians have to change the culture of get and not get rid of when it's time, or not give.
I think as that time draws near for all of us, the relationships, like you said, with those around us are so important, but ultimately our relationship with Jesus and our constant focus of salvation, and you know, we sang this song in worship this past Sunday, and when we all get to heaven. And so it's like, if we could just keep that mindset, right, of when we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing it will be. You know, when we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Like if we could only but just realize all of these things that we're collecting here on earth are just temporary.
Very temporary.
And but our relationship with Jesus and when we get to heaven is forever. You know, if we could just...
And the stuff that we are having to spend all of our energy on is a distraction from that. So let go of the things when it's time, and so you can focus on what's really important. So that's why I do what I do.
So it takes a lot to put yourself out there like that. We all give Lynn a hand for sharing all that. And Lynn, I'll also tell you, so, you know, Renee and Brad Baldwin come to the 8:30 service, and Renee is in charge of our His Helping Hands ministry, which is our outreach ministry that provides clothing and housewares to the community. And I walked out of the sanctuary after the 8:30 service, and she grabbed me by the arm, and she said, "Andrew, what have you done?" She was like, "Everybody in the church is going to go home and empty out their mini storages and going to bring them up to the church this week." And I was like, well, you know, that might be... Lynn Redding would tell us it's not a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing. What Lynn does is she helps people to let go. To let go. And what letting go is learning how to die. That's what it is. This is something that the scriptures have a lot to tell us about. There's a lot in the scriptures about what it means for us to die to self, to die to the things of this world. Paul tells us in Galatians 2:20, he says, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me." Getting ready to die, dying a little bit each day, it doesn't have to be a sad experience. It doesn't even have to be somber. It can actually be an experience like I think it was for Mike Corpy that was filled with anticipation of that which is to come, of letting go of the things of this world so that your hands are free to lay hold of that which is eternal and everlasting. There's this wonderful exchange in the story of the raising of Lazarus when Jesus arrives at Bethany and Martha starts fussing at him. I love this because there's not a lot of places in the Bible where Jesus just gets fussed at. His mom fusses at him when he's 12. Martha fusses at him in Bethany when he shows up. And she says, Jesus, if you had been here, Lazarus, my brother, would still be alive. And Jesus turns to her and he says to her, Martha, your brother will rise again. And she immediately, almost in knee-jerk fashion, she gives him an answer that's like a seminary student answer. In fact, she sounds like a seminary student. He says, your brother will rise again. And she answers a question off the test. She says, oh yes, I know that my brother will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And he turns back to her. And in a word, in a phrase, he jars her out of her faith in doctrine. And he shows her what it means to have faith in himself. He says, Martha, I'm the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. If you just sell out for Jesus, folks, if you'll just sell out for Jesus, if you'll just take him at his word when he says that he is the Alpha and the Omega, or what Hebrews refers to as Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, the author and the finisher. If you'll just build your house on the rock that is Jesus and not the shifting sand, if you'll make him the foundation of your life, then you'll be able to die a little bit each day. Because you'll know that truly you're already dead. Because those who have faith in the Son of God have died with him in his crucifixion, and they have been raised with him in his resurrection. And because of that, you'll truly never taste death. All you'll experience is a translation from a life that is shadowy and forgetful to a life where you will know fully, even as you are fully known. Trust in that and trust in him, and you'll be prepared. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.